Here we go. This is not an easy subject. Why is it that our entire nation seems to be exhibiting the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD? Think about this. These are the symptoms of PTSD. And when you hear these symptoms, you'll realize that it's not just our soldiers, but these are the major social problems that our entire nation is facing. Substance abuse, high divorce rates, domestic violence, intimacy problems, suicide, homicide, sexual promiscuity, child abuse, and employment difficulties. These are all epidemic throughout our population. Now, we might be able to understand why soldiers who face the traumas of war find themselves wrestling with these social and personal demons as they try to make it back into civilian life. But why are so many American civilians dealing with these same symptoms? Some of the brokenness in our nation, in our cities, in our families, and in our own hearts can be traced to the way that we practice war against other countries and the way that we relate to our planet. Let me say it this way. Currently, we have a culture of denial of responsibility for the wars we fight and the ways we live. I'm going to try to explain what I mean. We are a nation at war in the longest war in this country's history. And yet, it is the least percentage of our population that has ever fought a war. The responsibility is not being shared broadly. And in fact, many of us don't even remember we're at war most of the time unless we have a friend or a family member in Afghanistan. Only 1% of our population is fighting. And most Americans are going about our lives, shopping at the mall, going to see sports, mowing our lawns, paying our bills. There's no draft, so the burden of risk is being borne by a very small slice of the population. If there was a draft and all families had to potentially sacrifice their children for these recent wars, I doubt they would have ever started, and I believe they would have ended a long time ago. We are not paying for the war. This is the first time in our country's history when we actually cut taxes as we went into war and decided to pay for it on credit. Many of us individually are borrowing money from MasterCard to go to the mall, and all of us collectively are borrowing money from China and other nations to go to Afghanistan. I think that you'll agree that if you and I were having to pay for this war in real time through higher taxes or program cuts, that it would have never started, and it certainly would have ended a long time ago. Now, even more, the federal government has restricted the television media from showing images of body bags and flag-draped coffins in this war. And I believe that if we were seeing the images of our young men and women coming back dead, we would have ended this war a long time ago. The point is that as we are waging a war of choice in Afghanistan, we are waging a war of denial here in America. And the reason that I'm bringing this up at all is the fact that by doing this, we are beginning to forget who we are. Our veterans need us to remember who we are and to remember our role in the bargain we strike whenever we send our children into war on our behalf. When we go to war, we all make an agreement. And most of us have forgotten or never realized our part of the deal. Throughout history and throughout different civilizations, there has typically been a warrior class and a civilian class, and there is a reciprocal relationship between the two. Soldiers take on the responsibility to defend their country, and the rest of the citizenry has a responsibility to help heal those who have put their lives on the line for us. Last Friday night, I went to the Shabbat service at the synagogue just down the street here, and they had a special speaker from North Carolina named Dr. Harold Cudler. who talked about the Hebrew Scriptures in the book of 1 Samuel and how King Saul lost his kingship because he did not obey the role of his role in the mission of war. The Scripture says that God told Saul to annihilate the Amalekites, and this meant every man, every woman, every child, and every animal. What a loving God thou art. Anyway, this is not a sermon about God. That's actually next week. We're gonna actually have 3 sermons next week in each of the services. Tamara's going to preach a sermon at 8:30 on the case against God. And this God is going to show up, I'm sure, in her sermon somewhere. And I'm going to preach a sermon at this hour at 10 o'clock in our traditional service on the case for God. And then at 11:30, Tamara's going to come back and preach a sermon on why does it matter anyway? So come and spend the whole day with us next Sunday and bring your friends. It ought to be an interesting dialogue from this pulpit. But my message today is about war. The mission was that King Saul was on. He had to destroy all the people and all the animals, but he didn't. And in the end, we're told that Saul loses the anointing of God for his leadership because of it. This is what we call today rules of engagement in war. In our current war in Afghanistan, I've been told that the rules of engagement in most instances say that if you are driving a truck and the truck in front of you is blown up, that you are not to stop to help the soldiers in that truck that's in front of you, but to keep going. It doesn't matter if you have been training for months with these soldiers and if they are injured, still alive, on the side of the road. Your job, rules of war, of engagement is to keep driving, and in fact, if the truck is blocking the way, to push it out of the way and keep going. It doesn't matter if there are women with babies in their arms in the road in front of you. The rules are to drive on, even if it means running over them all. Now, why do we have such rules of engagement? The idea is that the lives of the people in your truck, all of them, are at danger, and they're depending on you keeping moving, and the people in any of the other trucks in the convoy are depending on your truck continuing to move. If you stop, you are endangering all of them and the entire mission that you're on. Soldiers have come back talking about being haunted by hearing the sounds, the bumps, as they ran over people in these kinds of situations. These are the kinds of psychological and spiritual wounds that combat soldiers and the commanders who are sending them on their missions are returning with in their hearts. I saw one soldier talking on film just the other day about being in a situation where there was a 10-year-old boy who was throwing grenades at his unit. The commanding officer had 6 men with him whose lives were all threatened by this boy. It was a choice between losing 5 or 6 of his own men who would not go home to see their families, or shooting a 10-year-old boy. He killed the boy. We are taught all of our lives that one of the worst things we can ever do is to kill someone. And then we send our soldiers into situations where we ask them to kill on our behalf, where the right thing to do is to kill if they're following what they're supposed to be doing. And it doesn't matter if a person knows with total certainty that what they have done and what they are doing is something that they need to do under the circumstances. It still leaves an invisible wound. Think about if you were driving your car and a young child ran out into the street and you ran him over. It wouldn't matter if you were doing all the right things. You were doing the right things. You would be haunted by that memory for the rest of your life. When we send our young people to war, we are asking them to face these realities on our behalf. And it is our job as the elders, as citizens, as religious people, to do our part when they come home to help them to heal from these experiences. And this is true whether we agree with the war or not. This is the reciprocal relationship between warriors and civilians in any community. What we tend to do for our troops instead is, we'll give them a seat on the airplane, we'll buy them a cup of coffee at Starbucks, maybe pick up their bill as a surprise in a restaurant. We'll cheer them as they come into a facility as heroes and tell them how proud we are of them. But there are a lot of times when they don't feel like heroes, when they don't feel proud of what they've done. And in fact, being told you're a hero and being applauded as one when you don't feel that way just increases your sense of isolation and alienation. They often went into the military with heroic intentions to protect the weak and their country, to save their buddies, and to exemplify courage and honor, but then found that they had mistakenly killed civilians or forced themselves to drive past wounded children, or had failed to save a comrade in a moment of potential heroism, or in some other way missed their moment of truth. An article in Newsweek that just came out this past Monday is titled, "A New Theory of PTSD and Veterans, Moral Injury." The byline says, soldiers are supposed to be tough, cool, and ethically confident. But what happens when they have seen and done things that haunt their conscience? In the article, it states more than 1 in 3 soldiers reported killing the enemy. Other research found that 1 in 5 acknowledged killing a civilian by mistake. 2 in 3 handled or uncovered dead bodies. And the same ratio saw wounded and sick women and children that they could not help. Nearly 80% had lost a friend or had a friend wounded. War itself, no matter how just, no matter how important, will leave many of the men who fight it feeling that they have dirtied their souls just by the very nature of war. And perhaps there's a simple reason. There is just something about killing that bites the conscience and doesn't let go. The term moral injury refers to when we go against our moral convictions, we are injuring ourselves. We are going against the most important part of who we are. We injure ourselves. When we injure ourselves physically, it's usually because we've done something that took us past the limitations of our body. And when we cross moral boundaries, it also causes pain. Sometimes it is a split-second decision in combat that can never be forgotten or undone. My point is that wars do not end when soldiers come home. Instead, they continue in the souls of those who fought and in their families and communities when they return to civilian life. Our whole society bears responsibility for addressing moral injury. That was an interesting slip. I almost said our whole society buries the responsibility for addressing moral injury, which I think is my concern this morning, that we bury our responsibility rather than recognizing that we bear that responsibility. Whether or not we supported the war in the first place, we still have an incredible responsibility to our returning soldiers. And as Dr. Kudler said in the synagogue last Friday, and as I've noticed in working with returning veterans over the last 10 years, psychiatric diagnoses do not really address the deep grief of moral injury. Moral injury is a wound to the spirit when we believe that we have done or witnessed something that has violated our deepest sense of right and wrong. These are wounds to the spirit that are not healed by psychiatric drugs or by ordinary talk therapy. There are some therapies that are starting to make some inroads, but ordinary talk therapy and psychiatric drugs are not the answer to moral injury. This is where the religious community comes in. This is our part. And as you may know, I've spent many years studying and living in different countries around the world, and I am a student of ritual and the power of ritual for healing and transformation. And here's what I've learned about rites of passage. There are 3 elements to a rite of passage ritual, and we see them in lots of cultures and lots of religions. They are separation, ordeal, and integration. So in a typical rite of passage ritual, the initiates are separated from their usual life, from their home, from their family, from their comfort zone, if you will. And for example, a Native American ritual that many people you hear talked about is called a vision quest. And in one version, at least, of a vision quest, the young initiates may be taken far from their home into the forest or up into the mountains and left alone for 3 days. That's an example of separation. The next path of such rituals is ordeal. In the case of a vision quest, the young initiates might create a circle on the earth that's 2 arm lengths in diameter, and they're given a knife or a weapon for protection and a bottle of water, and they're told to stay in the circle without leaving until someone comes to get them. They have no food, they have no shelter, and no matter what happens, they are told to stay within that circle until the elders come, sometimes 2 or 3 days. That's an ordeal. The last stage is integration. After 3 days, the initiates are rounded up, they're brought back to the village, and there they are surrounded by the elders of the village who mentor them by helping them to understand what has happened to them and what it tells them about themselves. These elders help the young people going through this experience to integrate what's just gone on with who they are and who they're going to be. They do this with an understanding that this is how these young people then become adults and mentors and positive contributors to the society. So there's separation, ordeal, and integration. Initiation rituals require all 3. And unfortunately, in American culture today, we have lost much of our understanding of the role of rites of passage. And many of our young people do not have mentors or elders whom they trust. Today, some youth join gangs in order to find rites of passage type experiences and because they're seeking mentorship. These gangs are giving them what they're looking for, except albeit not in a very positive way. When an initiation ritual is done, then the initiates are taken to a new level of consciousness and understanding, a new level of maturity, a new level of adulthood, a new levels of courage and compassion and understanding of their own capacity. So now let's look at war as a rite of passage. It involves separation from one's home, one's family, one's culture, everything one knows. And it certainly involves an ordeal. I don't have to say anything more about that. But here's the problem and the opportunity. In order for a rite of passage to work, it requires the 3rd step, integration. And it is this 3rd step that is often left out by our current military and civilian culture. These young men and women who've gone through one of the most profound initiatory experiences that they will ever encounter, and yet we do not take them through the 3rd step to allow the cycle of initiation to be completed. And that's why so many veterans end up on the streets, addicted to drugs, having a hard time holding down jobs and marriages, and as we've seen recently, alarming statistics about suicide. The rate in suicide just with military before they come back has become, suicide is the #1 killer of active duty people in the Army, not the war, but suicide. More than 1 a day has been happening on average. In fact, and then if we talk about returning veterans to our country, 1,000 a month are attempting suicide. They say that every 90 minutes, 3 returning veterans will attempt suicide, which means that in the time that I deliver these 3 sermons this morning, 9 veterans will attempt suicide and 3 will be successful. That's the magnitude of the problem and the reason that I'm standing before you to talk about it this morning. We need to be surrounding our veterans who are coming home with wise elders and community, folks who can help them to integrate their experiences into their lives so that they can make sense of what they've been through and begin to recognize it as an age-old process of learning and growing and becoming elders in one's community. When we learn to do this effectively, then we will not only help our soldiers to heal, but we'll also begin to help them to grow in wisdom And we'll also help them to become productive citizens and elders in our own communities and in our church. It's been said that the first casualty of war is truth. These veterans have a truth about life, about war, about peace that the rest of us do not have. And it is really important for us to help them to get to a place where they can share that truth with us. We need them to be able to share that for the good of our nation and our future. The way that we have kept these two wars at arm's length by not paying for them, by not broadcasting them, and by not participating in them in most cases, is a reflection of the way that we have perpetuated a culture of denial around war and its effects. And one of the things that we are denying is the reciprocal relationship that we have between soldiers and civilians. We've also lost our relationship to rites of passage, many of us in our culture, and the role of initiation rituals to take us to new levels of wisdom and compassion. Initiation rituals teach us that ordeals that we go through in life, and this isn't only for soldiers, this is for all of us, the ordeals, the wounds, the violence, the difficulties that we experience, the harsh realities, the deaths, and all of it. These ordeals that we experience in life are deeply initiatory. These wounds that we pick up through the process of living are in fact gateways for our giftedness and for our ability for success and giving back in our world. There is a relationship between our broken hearts and our ability to share our gifts with virtue in the world. And the denial of our broken hearts and our brokenness is one of the things that's keeping us from really coming into our own as people, as individuals, communities, and even as a nation. But we need mentors. We need wise people who can help us show us the way. And I don't think it's a coincidence that having lost these capacities, we find that our entire nation is exhibiting symptoms of PTSD. As we wind down America's longest war, I expect that my ministry and this church will be a source of healing, a place of healing for returning veterans and their families. It already is, but it could be even more as we learn to embrace those who are returning. If you are one, a family member or a veteran, or if you have ideas of how we can do more and do even a better job as we wind down this war, I'd ask you to come talk to me. Make an appointment. Let us remember that in traditional societies, they understood that warriorhood is not soldiering, but it's a path of life, a warrior's path. It is a life of virtue in times of conflict and in times of peace. They had responsibilities that kept them busy throughout their lives, including mentoring young men, and in our case now today, young women. We have something to offer our returning military personnel, and they have a lot to offer us. And we, as a community, as we are able to surround them with a sense of gratitude and healing by listening to their stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to offer rituals and opportunities to help them to integrate what they've been through into their lives so that they can step forward with confidence. They are a part of us. We are a part of them. You are a part of us. We are a part of you, and we honor our warriors, we honor our soldiers, and we join them in collective responsibility for what they have done. We join them in collective responsibility for what they've done, and we can show that most powerfully by embracing them, by listening to them, and not shirking or running away, even in the difficult conversations. Maybe we can even help some of our veterans to work with us to create a kind of service corps that we could use to do work in the inner cities and in the schools, to mentor our youth, to teach us the ways of peace, so that someday no one's children, no one will have to go to war. Amen.